Today I want to talk about a potential serious issue, and that's an unemployment crisis happening in 2021. The majority of people right now are talking about whether or not the stock market's going to crash or how fast or slow the economy is expected to grow, but at the end of the day, most people care about their jobs. That's the most important aspect in their day-to-day life. Obviously, 2020 did not make it easy for people in terms of unemployment. We saw a huge spike in unemployment, followed by a pretty rapid drop within a few months. I think this gives a false impression that the worst is over, but the reality is things can get much worse, especially in the upcoming months. And I'm really not one to feed into fear, but I do this video to help people prepare for the worst. You can kind of think of it this way. If I end up being right, then, you're in the best position possible to be prepared for that unemployment crisis. But if I end up being completely wrong, then at worst, you spend maybe a few hours preparing for a potential unemployment crisis. So why do I think the unemployment rate might jump up in the next couple of months? Well, it's actually pretty simple, and it's all due to holidays. You see, almost all companies make up the majority of the revenue at the end of the year, so kind of towards a holiday season going from October to December. You have holiday shopping as well as even like holiday type or end of the year type bonuses that end up contributing to people spending more, which ends up giving a boost to small and large businesses. In fact, some companies can even end up losing money throughout the majority of the year, but once it comes to that holiday season, they make enough that throughout the whole entire year overall, they actually end up turning a profit. So in early 2020, a majority of companies ended up trying to adapt as much as possible. They ended up having curbside delivery or spending money to kind of have social distancing happening in their restaurants. But the reality is they were just kind of waiting it out to see if they can make it to this holiday season, or at best that, everything would just kind of blow over and that they could survive. But now that the holiday season is over and we're moving into 2021 and there's still a bit of uncertainty, we still don't necessarily know, just because of a vaccine getting distributed, whether or not companies are going to fully reopen or how they're going to adjust. Are they still going to have certain policies and restrictions? Are they going to have to increase spending to adjust for certain policies? So like I said, especially for like small to medium-sized companies, I think for 2020, a lot of them were just kind of waiting it out to the holiday season. But I think going into January all the way till March, a lot of these companies are going to make that tough call and that tough decision to go ahead and lay off some employees. Now, later on in this video, I'll talk about some of the signals you can kind of look out for so you can kind of determine whether or not there really is going to be an unemployment crisis in the next couple of months or not. But I do want to talk about why I think that this unemployment rate is actually going to be a lot different and even potentially a lot worse than in 2020. It all has to do with the type of unemployment we're talking about. So if you think about it, back in March of 2020, the people that were getting laid off at that time, it was kind of like restaurant workers or retail workers, which are relatively easy to kind of turn off and on in terms of unemployment. So then you think about what the type of unemployment that's expected to happen in the next couple of months, how that's going to be different. You see, now that 2020 is over, a lot of companies are going to be looking back at 2020 and realizing that they had record losses and they're not necessarily turning a profit. So they're going to have to make this tough decision on not only laying off like hourly type workers, but as a result, having to cut back on the number of accounts they have, cut back on their HR staff. And so this actually will translate into those higher tier employees in terms of salary. And I would even throw in some kind of specialized workers as well. So some construction crews might have to lay off specialized skilled workers. And if you think about these terms of employees versus people like hourly restaurant workers, it's a lot harder for them to transition. So you think about a cashier working at Target, it's relatively easy for them to find a new job as a cashier at Walmart. But if you're working as a specialized accountant or you're working as a specialized, construction worker, then it's relatively harder to kind of find a different job. Plus, you can think of it in terms of how it's going to impact the overall economy. So you think about these high income earners, how they end up spending a lot. So they may buy a new car year after year, but now that they got laid off, that's going to translate down to, the salesmen that work at car dealerships as well. So it's really going to have a big impact. And it certainly is true that some of these big companies like Home Depot and Amazon have turned record profits for this year, but it's certainly true that major industries like the airlines or entertainment industries have had huge losses in the current or in 2020, and that's going to translate and spill over to 2021 in terms of unemployment. Plus, on top of all this, you still are probably going to have a lot of restaurant workers, cashier, retail type workers getting laid off as well. And for them in the past, for example, when entertainment workers that worked for Disney got laid off, they were able to kind of fill other positions temporarily because you had the seasonal workers going into the holiday season, but that's not necessarily going to be so true anymore. For the past several months, you've probably seen job listings for places like the mall or places like Target heavily recruiting for the holiday season, but now that it's kind of coming to an end, a lot of those workers were either initially temporary workers, or or they're probably going to be laid off down the road. And if you think about how this could affect the overall economy in terms of unemployment and people having to transition to different jobs, every time a worker transitions, let's say they're working as a waiter at a restaurant and then they find a new job as a cashier at Target, they end up having this learning curve, right? So they're not necessarily as efficient as an experienced cashier. So then in terms of the overall company, let's say Target, they're hiring a bunch of new cashiers. They end up being less efficient, which then eventually translates to less profits, which then may end up translating into more unemployment. Now, I know I'm painting a bit of a scary picture here, and I know that it may not even come to fruition, but what are some of the signs we can kind of look out for to know or have some kind of indication whether or not an unemployment crisis is actually happening in 2021 or not? Well, it kind of relates to what I was mentioning earlier. When you go into Target and you see on their door, job listings or apply right now, or you go into McDonald's and you see, we're hiring starting at $15 an hour. Those are things that kind of give an indication. Once you see those signs starting to be taken down, that may kind of cause a little bit of fear, a little bit of worry. And you could even take this a step further by going on websites like Indeed and just putting in there accountant or HR manager and kind of comparing how many job listings are available in just even your local area and how that ranks up against to prior years. So 2 years ago, maybe there's 100 listings for an accountant position, and you search it today and it turns out there's only like 5, and then you search next week and there's only 2. So that's kind of a bad indication that people aren't hiring as much. And obviously the most concrete indication we can look at is the unemployment rate, or the amount of people that have initially applied for the first time unemployment benefits, and seeing if that's starting to trend upwards. And if that is the case, then that would be a bad warning sign. And I'll link the website to the Bureau of Labor Statistics that reports on unemployment rates. And while you're at it, if you wouldn't mind looking down below as well and hitting that subscribe button for me, I'd greatly appreciate it. So what are the steps you can take to best prepare for a potential unemployment crisis in 2021? Now I'm going to start with the most obvious step, which is to update your resume. I can't stress this point enough because it only takes like a few hours at most to update even a few different sets of resumes. And you're going to want to have a few different sets because if there is an unemployment crisis and you happen to lose your job, unfortunately, and you're trying to seek a new job, you want to make sure you have different resumes good to go. So let's say you work in an accounting position, but it's more food related. Well, you can have it tailored to that food industry accountant position, but you could also kind of stretch it to kind of just a general accountant position as well and have a separate resume for that. Depending on the job you're looking at, you can send either resume A or resume B. On top of that, I would also recommend just kind of generating a short list of companies that you're going to initially look for should you get unemployed, or maybe you're in a scenario that, I think it's very likely that a lot of companies aren't going to issue as big of a pay raise in this upcoming year, unless if you happen to work at, Home Depot or one of those companies that had record profits this year. I think it's a very real scenario that a lot of people should expect a little bit smaller of a pay raise than they did see in prior years. So if you end up in that situation, maybe you're becoming unhappy because you're taking on more responsibilities, but you didn't get the pay raise you expected. So you start looking at other companies. You're really going to want to have that short list so you can just immediately start getting the ball rolling on that job application. And it's like I was saying earlier, at worst case scenario, you ended up spending a few hours updating your resume and not needing to use it. But, that's not necessarily a big problem because at some point you're going to have to update your resume anyways. But at best case scenario, you're a few days ahead of the competition in terms of applications, and that can go a really long ways. The other step I highly suggest everybody take is to cut back on spending as much as possible and to save as much as possible. And I know you're probably thinking to yourself, shouldn't I be doing that at all times? And that is absolutely true, but I just kind of want to point out that the people who have this response that it's really difficult to save, I'm trying my best, you have to keep in mind that it's only going to be more difficult, especially if you end up unemployed or if there ends up being a recession in 2021. Plus, I know some people out there think, what difference is $200 extra saved going to do if I really do end up unemployed? But I really encourage people to think about that. That could be an additional month's worth of an electric bill, or, that's just a few weeks extra of groceries, depending on your family size, and it really will make a difference. Plus, I also think that line of reasoning can end up really dangerous. If you take dieting just as an example, you take somebody who eats, 5 or 6 donuts a day, ends up eating just potatoes and meat and giant rice bowls. I feel like I'm describing myself right now. But in all seriousness, if you think about that person, if they eat 5 donuts a day and they kind of tell themselves, well, what is one extra donut? Why is that going to make a difference? And they eat 6 donuts. Well, why not 7? Why not another? And they end up eating 20 donuts a day. Well, 20 compared to 5 really is a big difference. And you can kind of think about that in terms of saving. It's really easy to say what difference is $50 going to make, but it ends up kind of building this momentum and the snowball effect, and you end up saving more and more and more. The second to the last recommendation I want to give in terms of a potential unemployment crisis or potential recession for 2021 is to basically file your taxes as soon as possible in 2021. I mean, really, in general, you should be filing your taxes as soon as possible always, but especially in this particular case, because if you think about just delaying it a month and the fact that sometimes it takes a few weeks or even like 6 weeks to process a refund check coming back to you, and most people can't even file until the end of January anyways. So already we're talking about not getting a refund check until end of February or even mid-March. So if you end up delaying it an extra month, you could get a refund check all the way as late as May, April, even going into the summer. And if there really is an unemployment crisis, which I would expect, people to start getting laid off around February and March, you're going to really need that money. You're going to really need that refund as soon as possible. The last recommendation I would give anybody out there is to basically kind of take care of any finance housekeeping items. So whether that be finally starting that budget that you've been talking about, or selling those different things that can generate a few extra dollars in your pocket, or even building a new career skill set, those are things that are going to be invaluable going into 2021. And I do want to plug 2 quick videos that I made recently, one being potential jobs for 2021 that I think are going to see the most growth, as well as how to prepare for a recession in 2021, where I take more of how do you handle your 401k, or what should you do with your emergency fund. Those types of questions get answered in those videos. So please check that out, because I want people to have as much information and as much help as possible. Or maybe don't check it out. At the end of the day, when it comes to those videos, as well as just, taking care of things as far as selling things, building that budget, or developing that skill set, worst case scenario, you have a new skill set. Worst case scenario, you have a few extra dollars in your pocket and there isn't any unemployment crisis. Best case scenario, you actually do end up needing that money and you're glad that you sold those things in advance, and so that when you actually need that money, it's available. And if you want to share any of your own thoughts on a potential unemployment crisis for 2021 or how best to prepare, feel free to comment down below. I always love seeing other people's perspective on things. And if you like personal finance, business, or those types of topics, topics revolving around home buying, whatever it may be, I'm kind of stumbling around here, so that means it's the end of the video here. Consider subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next one.